Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod, where today we are talking about the Confederation of the Rhine's army in 1813. Joining us for this extravaganza is John Gill, who you will remember from our previous episode on the Battle of Wagram. He's recently written a book on the Confederation of the Rhine. We've got the details in the description for you, so you can check it out for yourself. And over the next hour, we're going to explore this army that personally I think doesn't get anywhere near as much attention as it should, to the point where I'm going to be asking some pretty dumbass questions over the course of the next hour. Joining me in the co-pilot seat for this one is Liam Telfer, Esquire. Hello, mate. How you doing?
I'm well, buddy. I'm really well. And again, it's a real unknown for me. So it's one of those things that I've heard lots of, but never really sort of, jumped in at. So yeah, really excited for this.
And Jack, how are you?
Very good, gentlemen. And happy to be part of this again. It's a real treat for me. It's a lovely day here in Virginia, and look forward to our discussion.
Okay, so I promised dumbass questions. I'm going to start with the most basic of them all, which is how. Talk us through how we end up with the armies of the Confederation of the Rhine. What's the, I guess, rationale behind their creation in the first place?
Can do. Well, it's to me a very interesting topic, and as you point out, I think quite correctly, one that does not get enough attention. We'll talk about a couple of things here as we go along, but I think there are five themes that we can highlight as we begin. That the Confederation of the Rhine, or Rheinbund, if I slip into Rheinbund, that's the way I tend to write about it. I apologize in advance. There's not a whole lot of scholarship on it in English in particular, and on the military side in particular. There's a lot of really good material if you're interested in constitutionalism in Germany or legal aspects or some of the political features, but not so much on the military side, except uniforms, as we'll discuss later. And it's this very ephemeral institution, but an important one. So the themes I think about are that we need, first off, nuance to think about each of these little states in its own way, because they're all different and they have different interests, different threats, different political structures, and different armies. So that's important. And secondly, is that they change over time. So the armies of when it begins in 1806 and 7 are different from those of 1809 to 1812, and different yet again from 1813, our focus today. There are also variations within each army, within each government, within each country, like any other army or country. And I'll talk a lot about, I think, the importance of leadership and how that plays an obvious role for armies, but it's useful to highlight. Finally, remember that this is an era of subjects, not citizens, and that it helps explain soldier loyalty and that sort of thing. But to get to your direct question, although Broken Eagles, the title of this study, examines 1813 in detail, it's helpful to look back to where the Rheinbund, the Confederation of the Rhine, came from, set the stage for addressing the point that you're asking about. So we're in the early 19th century. The Holy Roman Empire still exists, but it's crumbling under political pressure from the French, as well as internal struggles between Austria and Prussia on who is going to be the dominant force in Germany. So it's useful to keep in mind that the Habsburgs still have a grip on the Holy Roman Empire in 1805 and early 1806, and they yet invade Bavaria, a member of the Holy Roman Empire. Well, the Bavarians don't like this very well. They sign on a bilateral agreement with the French, as does Württemberg, as does Baden. They sign bilateral agreements with Napoleon and take part in the war against Austria in 1805. And the Holy Roman Empire is clearly unraveling under these and other strains. Napoleon sees the Confederation of the Rhine that he is about to establish as an opportunity to expand French influence and hegemony even beyond the Rhine into Germany. It's been a long-term French project, not his invention by itself, but he has a chance to exploit this opportunity. Exploit resources from Western Germany for himself and for France, as well as diminishing Austrian and Prussian power and creating a buffer state or buffer region east of the Rhine. So the result is that in July of 1806, so before Jena, but after Austerlitz, the Rheinbund is established with no notice, with notice sent out that we will no longer, as member states, recognize the Holy Roman Empire. And Napoleon says that as well. So the Holy Roman Emperor, the Austrian Emperor, Kaiser Franz, recognizing the inevitable abdicates as Holy Roman Empire, and that institution goes away in July, August 1806. When the Confederation is established, there are initially 16 members. That grows to 36 after Jena, as French power spreads into central Germany. The major states are Bavaria, Saxony, and newly baked Westphalia. There's a second tier of Württemberg, Baden, Hesse-Darmstadt, and the Grand Duchy of Berg, plus a whole bevy of microstates along the Rhine and in central Germany. Napoleon initially sees this as a formal body with councils of princes and legal apparatus and that sort of thing. But those ideas all founder particularly on opposition from the states themselves. And that leaves the Rhinebund largely as a military alliance with member states who are required to contribute by treaty contingents to Napoleon's wars. But the members are not just vassals, or as one German scholar says, not just an aggregation of robots, which is a phrase I really like. Napoleon interfered very little if he thought a state was well managed, like Bavaria. But he interfered a lot if he thought the state was inept or inefficient. And that happens in Westphalia and in the Grand Duchy of Baden. In other words, the states, especially the larger ones, had a degree of agency. So they're not just waiting for Napoleon to tell them what to do and only doing exactly what he says. And being a member of this confederation had important benefits for the rulers, these monarchs, especially because these small states could not be entirely independent in the European scene at the time. Crucial for most of them, really for all of them, was that Napoleon more or less let them manage their domestic affairs on their own, which many of them saw as absolutely central to the rules that they established. Many were elevated in rank. Bavaria, Württemberg, those are the first time those two countries, and Saxony as well, they become kings. Hesse, Darmstadt, and Baden, they become Grand Dukes, which allows them to be called royal, your royal highness, that sort of thing, which people thought was very important. It also creates space for them to modernize their state structures, the bureaucracies, and the armies. They gain territory and population over time, and it allows them to preserve what they had, not only from Napoleon taking it, but also from their often very acquisitive German neighbors who had set their eyes on bits and pieces of fellow German territories. So with all that as kind of the political background and rationale, the requirement to provide contingents to Napoleon means that these guys will show up all across Europe and even in distant Spain. First in 1806, including several at Jena, then 1807, including some at Friedland. But in that period, those campaigns, mostly line of communication security, sieges, and other second line kind of duties. They show up in the Peninsular War from 1808 all the way to 1813, in some of the major battles, a lot of the minor battles, some of the terrible sieges, Gerona, for example, as besiegers and Badajoz as defenders, and all the kind of dreadful and nasty incidents and actions of that conflict in between. To me, 1809 becomes a year of emergence for these armies in Central Europe in the war against Austria, where they have a major frontline role and a lot of independent missions. And in 1812, they all contribute forces to, or most of them, there are a few exceptions, to the invasion of Russia. These are generally very fine armies. They play roles in all the great battles as well as flank protection, but they are all utterly destroyed, just like the French. So in 1813, once again, Napoleon calls on them to provide contingents, all these little states, or some of them fairly major states, but they all have to be creating their armies from scratch, all anew. Thus, they're not the same fine armies that marched into Russia in 1812. They are present and often central to all the major battles, from Lutzen to Leipzig. It's a nice alliteration there. There's some glory, some ignominy, and some infamy, as we'll discuss as we go through. So, back to you.
Wow, what a scene setter there, Jack. Thank you. Looking at these sort of military forces and the military structures, how much opposition is there to the creation of them? Do those who serve do so willingly, or is their service a source of resentment, perhaps?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there was certainly a degree of opposition, as one can easily imagine, but also probably not as much opposition as people have in mind in general. So let's highlight a couple of points. First off, conscription was being introduced at this time, and that was widely hated all across Germany, just as it was in France. For Germans in the Confederation, this was often seen as imposed by the French, even when it really wasn't. even when it was something that their own government had instituted. But most of the German states did indeed introduce conscription for their own interests, because that was seen as a central element to army modernization. In part, modernizing the army was to meet French expectations, but also to meet the requirements of this new form of warfare that had come about in the past several years, or 20 years from the time of the French Revolution, and to bring their state apparatuses, their bureaucracies, into what was seen as a modern form. So that conscription was central to all of that. I would need to do more research here, but I suspect a lot of the German governments were quite content to have the French take the blame for conscription, even if it was their own local initiative in Munich or Darmstadt or Stuttgart or wherever. But that brings us back to the point about populations being subjects, not citizens, and most people being focused locally, not in some kind of pan-German fashion. That is, these were subjects who owed their duty to their sovereign kings or princes or dukes, or in two cases to princesses who were regents for their younger children. And most of them see themselves as Bavarians, as Badeners, as Hessians, as Württembergers, etc. Yes, they're within a larger German cultural linguistic context or community, but the primary identity is local. So what people often use the term particularist or particularism to describe this. Furthermore, for most of the officers, many of them, probably most of them, they see France and service with France as a career opportunity, a chance for professional growth in Europe's premier army of the day, combined with the honor of serving under the eyes of the emperor. And this sort of thing comes up again and again in both contemporary correspondence as well as in the memoir literature. And men of all ranks felt themselves part of something greater than themselves. So this is in part Napoleon's charisma. As a Bavarian artillery corporal will write about 1809, as if touched by an electrical charge, the entire army was suddenly filled with joy and hope when Napoleon arrives in Bavaria in 1809 in April. And part of this was part of being on the winning side in grand historical events. We can now turn to a surgeon from the Baden contingent who mentions that the men of the Baden contingent were accustomed to pull the chariot of victory. Another wonderful phrase. Where they served mattered a lot. Service in Spain, for some, initially seemed like one of these career opportunities, but it quickly becomes detested. Going across the Rhine came to be seen as more or less selling yourself as a mercenary to France with no honor and no end in sight. Service elsewhere, however, did not present such problems, up to and including 1812. So there's no serious or widespread objections to service against the Prussians or the Austrians or the Russians. We could talk about the Tyrol and Bavaria. It's a really interesting example. There are certainly exceptions, and then some highly placed individuals, the crown princes of both Bavaria and Württemberg, for example, were filled with passionate romantic notions of sort of pan-Germanism, kind of pan-Germanic patriotism, and definitely loathed the person of Napoleon Bonaparte. But the majority of people, as soldiers in 1812, seemed aligned with what a Württemberg staff officer who noted that, quote, the astonished world has never seen a finer, more battle-ready, more battle-hardened army, an army for which history finds no comparison in terms of military fame, of experience, and of boundless faith in its thus far ever victorious commander. So here's some fellow writing before the armies crossed the border into Russia. The horrors of that campaign, however, bring change. And we can turn to a different Württemberg officer who also fought in 1812 and 1813 for a rather pithy summary. We'll talk about this guy a little bit later as well. Never in the entire reach of history, he writes, has the world seen an event that can match in ghastliness the destruction of the French army in the fields of Russia and Poland. So therefore, the new armies reconstructed that take the field in 1813 are different from their predecessors. And that's kind of what sparked my interest in the first place and why we're focused on it today. So they're the old armies of pre-1812 and up to 1812, up to Borodino and Moscow, they're gone. And now new armies will have to take their place in 1813.
Jack, I'm going to be deeply unfair at this point and go completely off script and ask a question that is by no means simple to answer and could frankly be the topic of an entire episode. And we will indeed call or name the episode after this. But you're talking there about pan-Germanism. There's a lot of talk about Napoleon's role and the extent to which he's either a buffer to or a facilitator of the unification of Germany, or at least sort of a a growing sense of German nationalism. And we talk about nationalism quite a bit on this show in that sense that that's a very woolly term. Nobody's quite kind of worked out what a nation means to people at this point in time. But with all of this going on, with all of these kind of these stigmas and all the rest of it, to what extent can we talk about this force as Germany's first army?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think I would call it rather an, an army of Napoleon's empire, or a part of Napoleon's imperial army. However, the point you make is a really good one. It does deserve more time and more thought. I do address some of this in the epilogue and whatnot in the study that Lord willing will come out later this year. That and that's why I brought up the term particularist, because most of these people, most of these men, and one presumes the civilian citizens back home, they're really tied to their local monarchs, the King of Bavaria. Well, our previous Grand Duke is now a king. Isn't that wonderful? And to their local territory. And they're very conscious of being German in the sense of a fairly common language, although if you took people from two sides of what we think of as Germany today and put them in the same pub, they would not necessarily be mutually intelligible if they spoke in their local patois. But there's a sense of a common German literature, a common German language, a cultural affinity. But that didn't. And there's an American scholar who talks about this as being kind of a horizontal connection. But the vertical connection, where loyalty lies, is from the village and the subject up to the local magistrates and whatnot, to the duke or the king or the princess who rules your little part of Germany within this kind of larger German community. So it's, although there are those who want to portray this as a starting point for German nationalism, that's not entirely mistaken. And it can sharpen the difference between, and here I'm really kind of in a stretch, but it can sharpen the difference between people who speak German and live east of the Rhine and those who speak French and live west of the Rhine. So you could say, well, okay, I certainly am not a Prussian. I don't want to be a Prussian. I don't want Prussians to be in charge of me, but I'm not French. And so you could find this kind of a distinction. Much of the history and there's great commentary on this, and if we do another episode on this, I'll try to make a more coherent argument. Much of the history that was written after this period is very what people call Baurussian, and that's not Borussia Dortmund, but rather Baurussian in the sense of Prussia dominated, and where this Prussian style narrative dominates the historiography all up into World War II. Particularly in the years before World War I, and then as nationalism is again being cranked up in the 1930s. So I have a quote here later on from a fellow who's writing, I think in 1938, 39, who titles his book about the Confederations of the Rhine, Germans Against Germany. So that's kind of gives you the sense of how many scholars looked at the Confederation of the Rhine and the states which were members of it. I hope that kind of gives some flavor of things. And some of these ideas will come up later on as we go ahead.
John, I want to sort of zoom in a little bit now and look at these guys, look at these forces with a bit more of a sort of military mindset on. And I think it's interesting what you say, that they're allies, obviously, to the French, but they're sort of created allies by Napoleon for Napoleon, and rather than something perhaps a little bit more organic. So how good were they as allies in terms of, in training, their discipline, combat effectiveness? And I think probably quite crucially, how do they compare to the French at the same sort of level?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the nationalism piece that Zach asked about, of course, fits into all of this and provides, if you will, a background or a tapestry, a backdrop to these kinds of questions. But to get specifically to these military effectiveness angles, there is, as you might expect, a lot of variation. As with the Grande Armée, all of the German contingents had been destroyed in Russia, as we talked about. So as we come into 1813, these armies are being rebuilt. If we take some examples just to stun or appall your listeners with some figures. If we take the Baden Brigade that goes to Russia, they're about 7,600 that summer of 1812 as they march off. When they collect themselves in Prussia on the 30th of December 1812, there are about 425 effectives out of 7,600. The 452 Hessian light horsemen, they can only muster about 88 when they're reviewed by Marshal Murat back in Prussia on the 4th of January 1813. So these armies have been destroyed. So that'll have a real impact on how effective they then are, to answer your question. And they're therefore short of everything as they're being reconstructed. Men, muskets, horses, harnesses. Privates could be conscripted. So you could find common soldiers and the other ranks could be filled. Did not prove a problem for most countries. But good officers, good NCOs, that's a major deficiency and will remain a problem throughout. Many of the remaining officers are jaded, they're numb, what we would today think of as battle stress or PTSD. Some are still sick or wounded when they go off to fight again. One fellow from Württemberg talks about being in a carriage because he couldn't ride his horse yet as he makes his way off to the east again to once again take his place in the Württemberg contingent. And then many of the other new officers are very young, inexperienced. They might know little more about military affairs than their men do. Of course, horses have to be trained. And all this training, or most of it, is then done on the march. Plus, kind of an interesting angle, and this relates similarly to the question Zach asked about nationalism, whereas previous Rhinebund armies had this history of victory. The new men, they don't have that. They hadn't served again in the victorious war against the Austrians or the victorious war against the Russians or against at Austerlitz or any of those kinds of things. So in other words, they're very similar to the problems that the French army has. The monarchs and the officers feared for the honor of their countries and the honor of their armies if these young conscripts were thrown into battle too soon. So the King of Württemberg, for example, is very fearful of embarrassment and dishonor because, as he writes to one of his minions, half of the uniformed farm boys I dispatch will desert before they arrive at their destination, and these men will have no proper notion of duty. In fact, they did not desert, but this was his concern. And I love that phrase, uniformed farm boys. The commander of a Hessian regiment, similarly, now so going from the king to a regimental commander, complains that military history will be hard-pressed to provide an example of a regiment being constructed from scratch in such haste, with raw troops and led against the enemy. But his Grand Duke told him in March anyway. So I'm aware of all that. Get on the road. So there's several results of this. One is that units are often entering into combat only partly trained. And two is that some states could not send an entire contingent at once as Napoleon had desired. He's especially desirous of cavalry. Anyone who's looked at 1813 knows the French cavalry problem, and he's badgering these countries to provide light cavalry. But they can't do that any more than the French can. Nonetheless, Württemberg, Baden, Hesse-Darmstadt, they all send their contingent in bits and pieces, usually 2 to 3 groups, because they could not organize themselves well enough to send them all at once. However, most of them hold up fairly well, and almost all improve over the course of the spring and autumn phases of the war. As most of the listeners probably know, the 1813 war is divided into 2 phases, separated by an extended armistice. So from the beginning of June till the middle of August, there's an armistice, and that provides an opportunity for extensive training. And therefore, most of these contingents are greatly improved by the autumn because they really stress the training, organizational aspects. They get replacements, soldiers come back from hospital, that sort of thing. But they all experience the same problems as the French, with poor logistical and medical support. Some of that is the fault of the French, but some of it's also the fault of their local countries who don't provide enough supply wagons or don't send equipment and medical supplies and other necessities to their armies in the field as they were supposed to. And the Germans could be just as ill-disciplined as the French. They could be just as inclined to pillage for food or loot as the French might be. We can add to that that the poor rear area security that was prevalent in 1813 adds to this kind of long list of challenges or disincentives. There is rampant draft evasion in some states, particularly in Westphalia, and there is some desertion in the field. There's especially seems to be desertion as the soldiers are making their way from their home countries to the theater of war. But as far as I can tell, desertion rates are approximately the same as the French. This is a very tentative conclusion, and it would require a whole study in and of itself to get more precise. And that may not even be possible because of the problems with data. But there seem to be very few cases of mass desertion, and officers exerted themselves to prevent or punish desertion. There's some wonderful stories from the Hessians and the Badeners about how they treated deserters who were rounded up and returned to the ranks. As you might imagine, the soldiers who did not desert were quite keen to explain to their fellow deserters that deserting was a bad idea. And they treated them all sorts of inventive punishments. The Westphalians, however, and some of the microstates are different in some instances. And defection is a different matter. We'll talk about that later. So desertion versus defection, I draw a distinction between the two. And we can, that kind of, I hope, will lead into where we go with how they perform in specific instances of specific battles.
You have set that up very nicely for me to the point where I barely need to create a segue, because there is an important question. We can talk about things like cohesiveness and combat effectiveness, but ultimately the most fundamental measure for any army is, are they effective? If you use them in battle, do they stand? Do they fight? You know, what are the big flashpoints, I guess, for these guys where they sort of have a notable impact? And the risk of, again, hurling a question at you that's unfair, do they get the credit that they necessarily deserve, either from Napoleon or from their colleagues serving alongside them, albeit from other nationalities, in the field?
The answer to that is yes and no. And in terms of do they get the credit, I think oftentimes they do, but they can also be subject to being blamed for things that perhaps are unfair accusations levied against them. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of variation in combat effectiveness. But if we look at a couple of examples, favorable, negative, and then somewhere in between favorable and negative, we can get a sense of how these armies performed in the field in 1813, how they differed from one another, and how they contributed to victory or setback. If we look, take on the favorable side, two from that really stand out to me, two from one from the spring and one from the autumn. The first is the Württemberg division at Bautzen, which is, by the way, for your listeners, we may want to know that we're recording this on the 20th of May, the first day of the Battle of Bautzen. So nice anniversary. Well done, Zach, for choosing this. It's a huge battle, involves 260,000 men if you add both sides together, and it's one of the great what-ifs of this war. The Württemberg division numbers about 5,900, so 5,900 men. They played a fairly small role, important role, but a small role on the first day, 20th of May, in the center of the French line, under the Fourth Corps commanded by General Bertrand. But on the second day, they lead the attack against Blücher's Prussians in the center of the Allied defenses. And they demonstrate tremendous courage and tremendous tactical skill in helping to pierce the enemy line despite heavy artillery fire from the Prussians and Russians and a tenacious defense. All of this is visible from Napoleon's command post near the town of Bautzen itself. And if we then go back and recall the King of Württemberg, Friedrich, a really fascinating personality all by himself, a man of an enormous girth and yet iron will and high political intelligence. Very, very keen about his army. And he's the one who worried about sending uniformed farm boys who might dishonor the country, dishonor the army, and make a bad impression on Napoleon. Well, Napoleon, watching the Württemberg division attack, remarks to his surrounding staff and suite, "Look, gentlemen, my cousin, the King of Württemberg, made excuses that after the preceding campaign, most of what he was able to send me were conscripts. Well, gentlemen, look there and say if those are conscripts, because they had performed so well." The second example comes from the Battle of Dresden in the fall. And it's the autumn campaign. Even though the battle took place on 26, 27 August, it's known as the autumn campaign, reasonably enough. Part of that battle were the two Saxon heavy cavalry regiments. There were only two, and they were both part of the 1st Cavalry Reserve Corps under Marshal Murat. And they play a significant role in the great cavalry charges on the second day, the 27th of August, that rout the Allied left wing. Murat, who had chosen one of the Saxon squadrons as his personal escort, praised them afterwards in his report to Napoleon. The Saxon cuirassiers rivaled the French cuirassiers in bravery in all the charges they undertook. And Napoleon, writing to the King of Saxony, says that they covered themselves with glory. And he's also, that when he passes them at Leipzig 2 months later, he greets them and remembers their performance in August at Dresden. We could also mention excellent service by the Baden, Bavarian, and Westphalian troops in sieges, especially in Danzig, where the governor of the fortress, General Rupp, could hardly offer enough praise for the Bavarian and Westphalian regiments in the garrison. And the Bavarians generally perform pretty well across the board. The Westphalian 1st Infantry Regiment stands out in contrast to the skepticism of French commanders about Westphalians in the main theater of war. So here at Danzig, the 1st Regiment gets a lot of credit for its steadfastness and its skill, its courage. And there are any number of other small encounters and skirmishes where German troops on independent missions perform very well, where they choose defiance rather than defection or surrender, even when they're often on their own and could easily have slipped over to the other side. As far as your question about recognition, Napoleon is very generous with distributing crosses of the Legion of Honor, and the French reports often praise these men very favorably in public reports in the newspapers and such. Well, let's turn to the negative side. So there's a small battle at a place called Hagelberg, also on 27 August. And here, a regiment from Westphalia and one from the set of microstates in the middle of Germany do very poorly against Prussian Landwehr. These are all newly formed conscript units. They're poorly trained and they're surprised, but both of them, along with many of the French regiments, collapse. In the case of the Saxon duchies from central Germany, the drummers all flee en masse. And one of the companies seems to have given itself up as kind of an excuse to really defect. The defense of Westphalia itself in late September is also a problem. Although some units are steadfast, most disintegrate. In the defense of their capital, the city of Kassel, when faced with a large and very energetic Russian raiding detachment under a talented and energetic leader. The however here is that this need not have happened. Better leadership likely would have helped the army to stay together and might have held it together and defeated the Russians entirely. But King Jerome, Napoleon's youngest brother, King of Westphalia, and his generals could not provide that leadership. The generals available were more or less third-rate guys who could not hold their men together and generally if there was a bad decision to make, they would make it. There are examples of both devotion and defection at Leipzig, but we'll talk about that later, I think. And then there's several battles that we can talk about as questionable. But let me offer my assessment. One of those, also in the second half of the war in August, is a place called Grossbeeren, south of Berlin, on the 23rd. This was definitely a defeat for the French 7th Corps, which is composed of 2 divisions of Saxons and 1 division of French. It's often called the Saxon Corps. It's not quite the same, quite correct, but 2/3 of the men were indeed from the Saxon contingent. But to me, the onus for this defeat rests squarely on the soldiers of the Corps commander, a competent general named Jean Renier, but in this case fails in a variety of ways. So it's not a lack of courage or competence among the Saxon troops, but it's easy to blame the Saxons because they're the ones involved and they take heavy losses. Another battle is also in the autumn campaign. It's in a place called Dennewitz on the 6th of September. The Württemberg division, the Saxon Corps, Bavarian division are all involved in this as well as others. Most perform well. They're solid, they're skillful, they try to hold together in the chaos of defeat. But Marshal Ney, who's in command, and Marshal Oudinot, who commands a corps there, specifically accuse the Saxons of causing the loss of the battle. But to me, this is largely an attempt to shift blame from their own shoulders to a foreign contingent. Ney had spoken scathingly of allies in general and the Saxons in particular on several occasions. And nonetheless, Ney, and several other senior French officers are sheltered in a Württemberg square as they're trying to retreat in the chaos at the end of this battle. And the dust, and one Württemberg officer said this reminded him of the chaos at the Berezina because it was so confused and disorganized. So in terms of, if you will, recognition, Ney's scorn was obvious. His after-action report was printed in the Moniteur, the French national newspaper. It's picked up by a Leipzig paper, so all the Saxons read this. He doesn't say Saxony specifically, but it's very clear what he means. So they're furious about this. Their commander, Renier, protests to Napoleon, and Napoleon then chastises Ney through Berthier. saying the emperor is displeased that you have talked about the Saxons and treated them this way. We're trying to console these people and keep them on our side, and this kind of action on your part is not helpful. So you get kind of a negative recognition for Ney, as he had negatively commented on allies in general and the Saxons in particular.
John, I kind of want to step away from this for a second, and I'm really intrigued to talk about how these armies were equipped and how they were accoutred. Now, I suppose there's probably two ways of asking this question. Is there any indication that they were almost prejudiced in terms of being given like poorer quality equipment compared to their French allies? Or is it perhaps that some of the states had like a sort of bigger budget per man type situation where they were actually quite well equipped?
Yeah, I think the equipment is pretty much standard across the board. They Many of them had sufficient muskets and whatnot in their arsenals. Some did not. Baden, if I remember correctly, was one of those, and they end up purchasing French muskets to equip their men. Things like so material gear could be acquired over time. It costs a lot of money, and their budgets are stretched. Their bureaucracies are stretched to do these sorts of things. In many of these cases, these are very small governments, and now they have to respond very urgently in a crisis situation, and their bureaucracies aren't set up to do that. The Baden commander complains they had sleeping. One of the things I learned was they had sleeping bags in those days, which I didn't know. And he says, can you please send sleeping bags to my soldiers? He doesn't have enough headgear and is trying to organize getting shakos for his men, which takes too long coming from Baden. The Bavarians complained about lack of supply wagons, the responsibility of Bavaria, and medical equipment, medical supplies, medical personnel. But generally speaking, in terms of equipment, pretty much the same. Horses were a real problem for everyone. There's an amusing incident where the Württemberg division is crossing the Elbe River at Dresden, and Napoleon's watching them. This is in May after Lützen, before Bautzen, and they're going across the river, and up comes the supply train for the Württemberg division, and this poor captain who's in charge of the supply train notices that Napoleon has paid attention to the horses drawing the wagons. He says, those horses should be with the artillery. And sure enough, someone comes along and takes all his horses from his supply wagons. And he's only able, by somehow meeting with Berthier, Marshal Berthier, the chief of staff, to get oxen to take the place of the horses. And when he reports ruefully to his division commander expecting punishment, the commander says, well, that's okay. At least we can eat the oxen. So in some cases, the Germans are better off than the French, but everybody's in trouble for equipment. So they're not neglected too much in that respect.
One of the things that we kind of have skirted around the edges of is, and you've alluded to this already, is that question about loyalty, morale, desertion versus defection, the way in which the tide is turning in 1813. And this becomes a really key aspect of the story of Napoleon's defeat. So talk us through the why of that. Why are some states' armies inclined to break up? Why do others change sides? Is there a right or a wrong from your perspective in terms of the almost the morality of that decision making? Talk us through your thoughts on all of this.
Yeah, this is a really interesting and tangled question. I talk about this a lot in the study. Morale on the part of the Germans certainly suffers in the autumn phase of 1813. In part because the whole campaign in the autumn opens with really a concatenation of calamities. Grossbeer on 23 August, the Katzbach on 26 August, Hagelberg on 27 August, Kulm at the very end of August, Dennewitz on the 6th of September, boom, 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 repeated defeats. Napoleon's not present at any of these, but it looks really bad. Plus, there's this rampant insecurity in the rear areas. And I really stress this because to me, it makes everyone uncertain. And it seems like the French are not in control of much because they're allied raiding parties running all around the rear areas and causing all kinds of problems. This is compounded by bad logistical support, and for the Saxons, the devastation of the Saxon countryside. So you can imagine, you're in your homeland, and your supposed allies are pillaging the villages, stealing food from the villagers, and most of the Saxon soldiers, of course, are peasants who would have been in those villages, who would have been planting the potatoes or tending the cows or feeding the chickens or whatever. And now the chickens are gone, the cows are gone, the cabbages are gone. They can really identify with the civilian victims. This sort of general sense of chaos and being on the losing side. This caused, in Bavaria in particular, but somewhat in Württemberg, the kings to request the release of their contingents. And their contingent commanders were trying, sometimes surreptitiously, to send home as many cotters as they could. So as the ranks diminish, as they lose men to sickness and battle, mostly sickness, of course, they say, well, look, we have these excess officers now because there are a lot fewer men, so we're going to send these lads back to Stuttgart or Munich or wherever. Plus, there's this general sense of disorganization and defeat that made some contingents more vulnerable to desertion, notably the Westphalians, many of whom, if you're a Westphalian, you're close to home anyway. So going away from the ranks, you're likely to find you're not too far from home, and the local people are likely to hide you, to abet your evasion and escape back to, Dingbatzdorf or wherever your hometown was. What did not cause mass defection and desertion, or what this kind of situation did not cause, was mass defection or mass desertion. The Saxons are a special case, and we'll turn to them in a moment. Most contingents continue to serve loyally, and they often fight with great skill and great determination, and often against very bad odds. They're often, even on, as I mentioned earlier, on independent missions where desertion or defection would have been very easy to accomplish because you're kilometers away from the nearest French, or off on some outpost where you're attacked by the Prussians, and you defy them rather than joining them. So some interesting examples are the Württembergers at what turns out to be a bad defeat at Wartenburg on 3 October, the Badeners and the Hessians at Leipzig, who refused to surrender or refused to change sides and go to great extents to prove that they have not changed sides and not been disloyal to their countries and to their monarchs, in both of those cases to Grand Dukes. And especially, as I mentioned, the Bavarians and Westphalians up in Danzig in the siege there, where General Rapp says to a Westphalian major, "Your people are soldiers who don't fear the devil in hell. Each of you has earned the cross." In other words, the cross of the Legion of Honor. At the same time, there were two relatively small cases of defection as the second half of the war begins. So in the night of 22-23 August, the regimental commanders lead 2/3 of the two Westphalian Hussar regiments to defect to the Austrians. And a month later, a Saxon battalion commander leads his men to defection as well. But in both those cases, their compatriots, so their fellow Westphalians and fellow Saxons, are outraged and or disgusted by this defection because they see this as violating their soldiers' oaths, abandoning their duty to their monarchs, and especially because it left their compatriots, their fellow soldiers, in the lurch. So you not only betrayed your oath, you not only betrayed your monarch, you betrayed us as your compatriots in arms. And in both those cases, the officers seem to have led their men away without telling them what they were doing until the last moment when the defection was already a fait accompli. And some of the men actually, in the case of the Westphalians, some of the men actually left and made their way back to the remains of the regiments. So this again highlights the importance of leadership, soldiers' loyalties to their commanders, and soldiers being placed in kind of impossible situations. Well, that brings us naturally to the two major cases of defection, both of which happen at Leipzig. One is the Saxon division, and the other is a brigade of Württemberg light cavalry. They're both complex tales, the Saxons in particular, but the defection seems to have been motivated by several factors. Anger at seeing their country, their homeland devastated by their supposed allies, as we mentioned, the poor treatment by Marshal Ney, and general resentment of the French overall, the hopelessness of the battle situation. I mean, they could all see that they were more or less surrounded, and things are not looking very, very rosy on the field of Leipzig on 18 October. And a belief that was widespread but false that their king, King Friedrich August, secretly wanted to break with the French. He did not. This was not his intention. He remains loyal to the end. but there was a widespread belief in the officer corps that he did, that this was really the king's intention. Well, this allows several officers who were key leaders who favored the anti-French kind of pan-German cause, all of whom later take service with Prussia, by the way. And they initiate and promote this defection on the battlefield. Many other officers feel deeply uncomfortable with this decision, and they find themselves kind of dragged along by events. It sort of happens to them, and the determination of a few pulls them along with it, and many never reconcile themselves with it. And even in some regimental histories written in the late 1800s, in a sort of height of pan-German nationalism and anti-French sentiment and this sort of thing, regimental historians and other historians will say, well, right, well, of course, by military regulation and law, this was wrong. This was not permitted. You know, we understand the appeal of turning against the French, but this was a mistake to go against your king's wishes. And these men, the Saxons, had no love for the Prussians. And as many of you probably know, it leads to a mutiny in Liège in June of 1815. And therefore, there are no Saxons at Waterloo because Blücher has to suppress them and send them off into Saxony, or send them back into central Germany, execute a few fellows, burn the flag of the Guard regiment, et cetera, et cetera. The Saxon king is held prisoner of war until 1815 because he refuses to surrender to the Allies. And the Prussians at the end of the Congress of Vienna take away half of Saxony, it becomes Prussian. So that's the Saxon case. The Württemberg Cavalry Brigade also defected on 18 October, but no coordination with the Saxons as far as we can tell. That's another complex story, largely centered on their commander, a guy named Generalmajor, Major General von Normann. And again, a case where the commander and some of the officers seem to lead the men away without their knowledge. And we don't have very many accounts from their ranks, but the one particularly that we do have suggests that the men didn't know what was going on. Normann, the general, is apparently tormented by indecision and a desire to preserve his troops. But his king, remember this obese, gigantic man of iron will, he is furious because he demands absolute obedience from his officers. He sees them as representing him. And when he learns that the brigade is defected, he orders Normann to be arrested and the two regiments disbanded. The other commanders punished. General Normann has to flee before he's arrested to Austria, and he is never reinstated. And the regiments are broken up and reduced in prestige in the Württemberg army. As far as the French are concerned, the Württemberg troops largely escaped French censure. There are only 900 or 1,000 of them anyway, and the Württembergers generally enjoyed a good reputation with the French. The remnants of the Württemberg division, for example, part with expressions of mutual respect from their French allies. But many French choose to blame the Saxons for the loss at Leipzig. Well, this is pretty silly. The defeat of an army of nearly 200,000 under Napoleon's personal command in a bitter battle fought over 4 days can hardly be blamed on the defection of one Allied contingent that numbered no more than about 3,800 men in total that went over to the enemy. So we can conclude, I think, with a couple of comments on defections overall. There's, I think, a general impression historically that all the Germans were out there eagerly seeking every opportunity to defect or desert. And there was certainly a growing anti-French sentiment, not necessarily pro-German the way it comes out later in the 19th century, but certainly anti-French sentiment growing in and across the Rhinebund. And there were desertions and defections problems that did exist, but I think they are overstated based at least on my reading. We've already mentioned the desertion rates seem to have been about the same as the French, and those, of course, were not very cheery, but nonetheless, the Germans did not exceed them as far as I can tell. And as for defection, if we count that there were 70,000 Confederation of the Rhine troops present under arms in August of 1813, perhaps 7,000 deserted, so about 10%. And that number goes down to 8 or 9% if we include the 20,000 or so who were in hospital at the time. So that's not an outrageous number, and certainly not war losing or war winning for the Allied side. And as far as we can tell, or at least I can tell, most of those who deserted or deserted did not join the Allies. Instead, they just wanted to go home. They didn't want to be at war with anybody. For the French, for anyone else, they wanted to go back to their villages or their homes and back with their families. Allied efforts to induce defection were only marginally effective as far as I can see. They had more success in coastal areas that had been annexed to France in 1810. So if you look at the units that are raised in what we think of as the Hanseatic cities, Hamburg and Bremen and these kind of areas that France had annexed, yes, there's a lot of unrest. A lot of German units are raised there to fight against the French in 1813, but not in the Confederation of the Rhine. So these guys did not desert the Württemberg or Baden contingents and join the Allies. Rather, they just tried to sneak back home to Karlsruhe or Stuttgart or what have you. The only exception being the fortress garrisons, not Danzig, and then really only after Leipzig, after news of Leipzig comes through and that the French are retreating to the Rhine or have gone over the Rhine, the soldiers who are locked up in places like Kustrin and Glogau, why are we here? The French are out of Germany. The Confederation of the Rhine is gone. I should be let go as well. And they will try to sneak off in very large numbers.
John, I've just been sitting here wondering, and are there, I guess, any or many, probably many memoirs is the better way to go with it, diaries, letters, things like that from particularly ordinary soldiers? Because for me, the bottom up is the really interesting way of looking at this history, or officers, of course, that shed light on their experiences.
The answer to that is a big yes, or I should say, ja, jawohl, but not in English. Very few in English. The bibliography for Broken Eagles, this thing I've worked on, has more than a dozen pages of memoirs, what I call memoirs, correspondence, biographies, and published documents, among which are a large number of German memoirs, some from civilians as well as soldiers. As I mentioned, however, there are very, very few of these in English. Those that do exist tend to focus only on Russia in 1812. And sometimes it's frustrating because the fellow wrote about 1813 too, but the published version in English stops in December of 1812. Or he was captured. And so, you learn about what it was like to be a captive deep in Russia somewhere. Some of those are, the two most famous are by a guy from Württemberg named Heinrich Vossler with Napoleon in Russia, 1812, published in 1969. And the fairly well-renowned Württemberg common soldier Jakob Walter, Diary of a Napoleonic Foot Soldier, published in 2 editions, the most recent in 1991. And those who are interested in the Peninsular War will be happy to know there are quite a few German memoirs on that experience as well, especially Catalonia and Gerona, the nasty siege of Gerona. But again, almost all of those are in German. There's some really good ones on Talavera, for example. For 1813, only one is well known, and that's the memoir by this Saxon major assigned as Napoleon's liaison, a fellow named Otto von Odelleben. And he wrote a book that was translated into English in 1820, so it's available online for those with Google Books and such things, called A Circumstantial Narrative of the Campaign in Saxony in the year 1813. This is very good. But people sometimes read only select bits of it that cast Napoleon in a bad light, and sometimes Napoleon looks pretty bad in his Odelleben's memoirs. But there's a lot more to it than that, and some real interesting nuance. Moreover, he wrote some other things as well that get forgotten. Especially useful are what he called his réclamations, his objections to the French edition of his memoir. The French edition has interesting editorial comment that's worth reading by itself. His objections are then interesting, that sheds more light. But he also did a study of Bautzen, and he did a book called Saxony and Its Warriors in German, so Sachsen und sein Krieger, that is also very, very useful. Among my favorites are a fellow I mentioned earlier here, this guy who fought in both 1812 and 1813, he was a Württemberg lieutenant named Christian von Martens. He also painted a host of delightful naive watercolors in 1813 and 1812, some of which we were able to get from the Württemberg archives, and they're published in the book for the first time ever. So there are some really fun scenes by this guy who was there and participated in these battles like Dennewitz and whatnot. Another favorite is that and also quite well known, but only in German, is by the commander of the Baden contingent, a guy named Wilhelm von Hochberg. There's a Hessian soldier named Martin Kösterus, who wrote what is essentially a history of the Hessian contingent, but he was part of it. And he does draw on other soldiers' memoirs and letters and such, but he also relates his own personal experiences as well. The Württembergers, General von Stockmeier and a captain named von Suckau have very good ones. Sadly, Stockmeier's was published only in the Stuttgart newspaper, and it's really hard to locate. A lot of the microstate officers who served in Danzig wrote really interesting accounts, and there's an array of memoirs from parts of Westphalia. It's also interesting to note several histories of 1813 that were written by veterans of the war. A Saxon engineer named von Aster, who wrote about Dresden and the fighting around there, as a really interesting commentary on Leipzig. And a Bavarian staff officer named with a wonderful name of von Fröldendorf und Waradheim, who wrote a history of Bavaria's wars under King Max Joseph, the fellow who Napoleon had made king in 1806. There are also a lot of materials that reside in archives. I was able to use some of these, but wish I'd had more time to find more, especially from Baden, but time ran out, and the publisher probably would have been frustrated if I tried to insert yet more text into what was already 2 long volumes. It's interesting, though, to examine, for example, this fellow Martin's. His memoirs were published, but in some ways they are different in published form than they are in the archival form. And he moderates some of the statements that he made about the Prussians, for example, in the version that ends up in publication. So he sometimes, in the archival version, the original manuscript, makes fun of the Prussians. Well, that kind of disappears in the published version. So difficulties of access and legibility, these can often be very hard to read, mean that we can really be grateful to a modern Saxon researcher named Jörg Titze, who's published a whole host of Saxon memoirs from 1813, as well as other wars, along with a ton of other archival material from Saxony, really invaluable stuff. Of course, we have to always talk about all the caveats regarding memoirs, or what some people call ego documents. All those apply. Whether one has to always be alert to misrepresentations, remembering with advantages, to go to Henry V, outright fabrications, and all those sorts of things. Or, I was the only one who stood up and fought when everyone else was running away, etc. The same things that come with regimental histories. But they're still irreplaceable with all those appropriate cautions. And in some cases, sadly, for example, with the Westphalian light cavalry regiment, it's the only source we really have, because Westphalia disappears in 1813, and all the archival material for the military affairs apparently was shipped off to Russia, where it remains uncatalogued in St. Petersburg somewhere, or in Petersburg someplace, as far as I know. So in some cases, all we have is the insights of this young officer who served in that regiment. And that's very limited and frustrating as an historian, but it's all you can go with.
Jack, you're teeing this up nicely for us to actually talk a little bit more about the rationale behind the book that is the interview, if you like, Broken Eagles, and the way in which you're doing something different. And this isn't a kind of acerbic, so why should people go and buy your book? What's so different here? It's more a kind of, how has your work kind of moved beyond the stuff that others have done before you, and how, perhaps more interestingly, on a kind of individual, personal and emotional level, has it changed your perspective on the men themselves who served in this force?
This is somewhat, this is a great question, and my poor family's put up with this for a long time, but I think I can say, and truly with as much humility as I can muster, that there's never been a study like this in any language. So no one has looked at the Confederation of the Rhine in this year, or really in any year, quite in this way. We can make a couple of points here. First, there are a number of contingent histories, and some of them are really excellent. For example, a fellow named Albert Pfister, who wrote in the late 1800s on Württemberg. But almost all of these are in German, and almost all are from the late 19th century, and none examine all of the Confederation of the Rhine armies in this final year of the alliance's existence, or really in any other year. Second, there are also some really good uniform books, and I would especially recommend, for those interested in such things, a splendid work published in 2019 by a team of German researchers, Markus Gärtner, Peter Bunde, and Thomas Hemann, which is available in English as well as German. It's a magnificent, large volume book. These gentlemen and another colleague named Marcus Stein have assembled paperbacks, much smaller, but nonetheless on the Saxon and Bavarian armies. And I'm very pleased that this team is putting together one on Württemberg, which has long been badly neglected in my view. That's slated for publication next year. So really looking forward to that. Ken Trotman in the UK has published two nice English language folios on Württemberg uniforms by David Wright in 2017. So all those works are really invaluable, and they're often beautiful, but they understandably focus on uniform details. So when did the shakos change, or when did they go from helmets to shakos? Who wore cords, who did not? What did officers' ranks look like, etc. But they seldom provide more than a summary kind of capsule overview of strength, combat actions. Where did they fight? When did they fight there? How did they do? Were they at full strength? Or were they detached off somewhere? And all those kind of combat action details, campaign details that I think are important. And though it's not a contingent history, I cannot really overlook mentioning a superb book on fortress warfare, again, a neglected piece of 1813 that was published in 2018 by Thomas Hemmann and Martin Klöffler. It's sadly, as far as I know, only available in German, called Der Vergessene Befreiungskrieg, the Forgotten War of Liberation, which is a marvelous review of the dimension that's, as I mentioned, often neglected, of fortress warfare and the thousands and thousands of French and many, many Germans and others who are locked up in fortresses all from the Rhine all the way to the Vistula often for months or almost a year at a time. Otherwise, the Rhinebund troops tend to be treated as kind of an undifferentiated mass. They're non-French and therefore of dubious quality, with little no sense of their background, the distinctions among the units, the politics involved, and what their fates were. This is true to a degree of the French at the time, as well as the enemies at the time. So some French officers are truly solicitous and attentive, but others much less so. And when you trawl through the French unit strength reports, the situation, for instance, sometimes it's hard to tell what the unit name is or the officers' names and the actual strengths. Sometimes the Germans merely appear with their authorized strength. You know that's not true, but okay, there's supposed to be 1,680 men in the regiment, but you know they're not that many. So what was it really? Well, who knows? The Allies could be just as loose. So they might use the term Saxons, and they don't mean the King of Saxony and the Kingdom of Saxony. Rather, they're referring to the 5 so-called Saxon duchies in the middle of Germany. So what I've tried to do is shed some light on all these forces, their strengths, their weaknesses, the attitudes of the officers and men, etc. I've specifically focused on when and where they fought and how they performed. There are about 100 maps and order of battle charts to help the reader kind of picture the involvement of these units from the end of the Russian campaign up to the Rhinebund dissolves in October, November of 1813. It's definitely a military history, but I also try to outline the political context for each state, showing how they're different, what the commonalities are, and provide some sense of the decisions of the monarchs and the bureaucracies, because that certainly informed how the troops behaved on the field. The Bavarian division, for example, it's very clear that these are a sacrificial force sent off to Napoleon while Bavaria is trying to decide what to do. And the division commander can tell that just by the lack of response he gets from Munich. And his despair often comes through in his correspondence back to Munich. He thinks sometimes his letters haven't gotten through because he's not getting any answers. So it's a companion volume to the 1809 study with Eagles to Glory, with a similar intent, kind of a similar structure, looking at each contingent sequence, and where 1809, as I mentioned, is I think of as a year of emergence for the Rhinebund troops. 1813, of course, is a year of dissolution. So it's my hope that if you finish a chapter, you as the reader will have a reliable account, a reliable analysis of how the contingent was formed, the politics of the time, and diplomacy, especially relations with Napoleon, when and where they fought across this broad theater of war, parts that were left behind in fortresses, etc. Strength over time, training, commanders, victories, defeats, marches and miseries, lots of misery. Views of the French allies, and even some amusements, such as the acting troupe that the Württemberg guys hired during the armistice because they were bored and found the tedium needed some kind of relief. I tried to let them tell the story to the degree possible. So we tried to spice things up with extracts from memoirs, as Liam mentioned, letters, official reports, and all that. I spent a lot of time in archives all across Germany to create as complete and accurate a picture as possible in what I think is a reasonable time and word length. The publisher probably thinks that's a bit excessive. But finishing the 2 volumes then should give the reader a good synoptic view of this institution, the Confederation of the Rhine, its principal function as a military alliance in combat in its final year of existence. If I can take a few more minutes, I would add that among the things that personally I've drawn from this research is confirming some previous impressions, such that most of the Rhinebone troops were more reliable than is commonly believed. Of course, it deepens your understanding of the army's appreciation for their contributions to the Grande Armée in 1813, as well as their deficiencies, and this distinction between the past and 1813. It also reveals the anti-French sentiment that was prevalent in many of the most of the Confederation states and armies. So these men were not immune to these sentiments. That's hardly surprising. But the fact that they were mostly particularist, local in their loyalties, not yearning for some great new Germany, and certainly not one under Prussian domination. Sort of, if you will, we wish the French would go home. We want to go home, and the Prussians should go home and stay home as well. Some French mistrust the Germans, but the Rhinebone troops are frequently, as I said, sent on these independent missions, sometimes with significant French forces under command of German officers. And the scenes of farewell are often quite touching in the mutual respect displayed. So French Colonel Jean-Nicolas Curlet of the 10th Hussars, who wrote a famous memoir himself, he had been brigaded with the Baden Light Cavalry. And he then says, as they're parting ways, although we will soon encounter one another's enemies, as long as I am commander of the 10th Hussars, not a man will draw his saber against a Baden dragoon. And there's the enduring power of Napoleon's appeal to soldiers. Even in the last moments, even as Napoleon is departing Leipzig on the 19th of October, he's about to cross the bridge and head off back towards France. The battle is clearly a major defeat. A Saxon guard officer in the town square in Leipzig Napoleon is saying farewell to the Saxon Grenadier Guards. And he says, the Saxon officer then says, my soldiers farewelled him with a lusty Vive l'Empereur. Other than my dialogue with the Emperor 4 days earlier at Holzhausen, I experienced here the most sublime moment of my career and was certain that this meeting would be remembered even 200 years on. So for me, it's taken me too long, to compose this study, so I've exceeded the Saxon major's timeline, but I hope that I've helped to revive the importance of the Confederation of the Rhine and its soldiers, and that this study will contribute a small bit to the larger scholarship, if you will, of this period.
Well, the ancient Egyptians used to say that an individual dies twice, the first time when they physically die, and then again when somebody says their name for the final time. And if that is indeed the case, then this piece of work certainly enables these guys' names to live on. Jack, thank you so much for taking us through an incredibly complex and diverse topic at a blistering rate. Folks, Broken Eagles, Napoleon and his German allies in the 1813 campaign. Volume 1 is available right now. In fact, it released the week that we recorded this episode. So head to Pen and Sword's website. We will put a link in the description and you'll be able to get it direct. I would also say that at the time of recording, there's a 20% discount. And also we have a discount code if you're a Patreon member. Just saying, it gets you 10%. So between those, I'm not saying that you should go and buy it on the cheap. That's not the intent of what I'm saying. However, if you are looking for a bit of a spicy deal, then hey, now's your opportunity. But I will warn you, volume 1 is 496 pages. So it's well worth the full amount of money. So head to Pen and Sword's website. We will put a link in the description. And Jack, thank you so much for being so generous with your time, not only on the Vagram episode, but also for this one.
It's entirely my pleasure. As I've said in our previous interactions, it's a great treat for me. I've spent a lot of time with this, and it's if I can share some of the materials I've drawn from all these archives, and it is a true blast to work in these archives for small states like Baden and whatnot, or Württemberg. The people are wonderful, and you get tremendous information. So if I can share a little bit of that with your listeners, that's a treat for me.
See, nothing epitomizes this show better than somebody sharing such an obvious passion for their period. Folks, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. We will be back very soon. Did you enjoy this episode? be sure to subscribe so that you can find your way back to us. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest news from the show, sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, online courses, and much, much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. And if you're looking for personalized merch for the Napoleonic nerd in your life, drop us a line on social media and we can design something for you. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in mid-May 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Indiana Fats, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Ian Harding, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Darla Vincent, Peter Findlay, Giovanni, Steve Gillen, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, and Wojciech Stefanovic. The Admirals, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, and Tim Pritchard. The Chiefs of Staff, David Maxwell and Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, and in the Legion to Scholars tier, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.